The morning they found the Panther, the mist over the northern fields clung low and heavy, rolling in from the Baltic like a shroud. The air carried that quiet stillness that only exists before something ancient decides to wake. A small crew of construction workers had come to dig trenches for new pipes on the outskirts of a forgotten German village named Wesslingen, the kind of place where barns leaned with the weight of age, where children still played between rusted tractors, and where the war had never been fully erased, only absorbed into the soil. They were working behind an old farm that had been there since 1938, a crooked red brick house surrounded by apple trees and silence. The farmer, an elderly man named Dieter Cruz, had lived his whole life there. He'd inherited the land from his father, who had fought and survived those final mad years of 1945. The younger workers often joked about the Nazi relics buried in old farms like his, the kind of macabre legends that every rural village seemed to have. But when one of their excavators struck something solid, something curved and unyielding, the laughter stopped. At first, they thought it was a tractor or an old silo tank. The sound of steel grinding against steel echoed strangely from beneath the ground. When the bucket scraped away more earth, a broad plate of metal covered in a thick crust of rust and dirt. The shape was unmistakable, the slanted armor of a tank's hull, the ghost of a cross barely visible beneath decades of mud. One of the workers jumped into the trench, brushing away the soil with his gloves. He froze, realizing what he was looking at, the blackened end of a cannon barrel, jutting from beneath the farm as if it were trying to breathe again. Dieter said nothing. His face turned pale as he told them, in a low voice, to stop digging and call the authority. When the local police arrived, they were skeptical. The old man insisted there was something beneath his barn, something his father had hidden. By the afternoon, an army of journalists, historians, and soldiers had gathered. The military cordoned off the area, and slowly, with surgical care, they began to uncover what time had hidden. The excavation took 3 days. Each layer of soil peeled away another decade, revealing the lines of the machine in painful detail. The long muzzle of a 75mm gun, the thick, interlocked armor plates, the massive tracks still gripping the earth like claws. The mud had preserved everything. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on the third day, it struck the exposed turret of a Panzerkampfwagen 5, the Panther. Its form rose from the dirt like a cathedral of steel. The crowd that had gathered stood silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. The historians from Kiel University began taking notes feverishly, photographing every inch. The serial number was still legible on the hull, 213045, matching records of a tank from Panzer Regiment 29, last seen retreating north during the final collapse of the Reich. Nobody knew how it had ended up here, under this barn, untouched for 70 years. Dieter watched as the past of his family came clawing out of the ground. He later admitted that his father had spoken, only once, about a tank during his dying days, something that should never be found. He'd been a teenager at the end of the war, helping his father hide it, terrified of the soldiers who would have killed them both if they'd known. As the recovery crew worked, the tank's presence began to infect the atmosphere of the village. Old men who had fought in the war came to see it, walking with canes, their faces lined with both awe and guilt. Children stared in wide-eyed wonder, unable to imagine that such a monster had once roamed their field. The mayor ordered the operation kept quiet, but it was too late. The media had descended, and the name, the Panther under the farm, spread across the internet like wildfire. When the hatch was finally pried open, everyone held their breath. The smell that emerged was old oil and damp iron, a scent that hadn't touched air since 1944. Inside, the light of the flashlights revealed a chamber frozen in time. The interior was perfectly preserved. The driver's seat still held the leather strap from a German helmet. The radio headset hung from its hook, its wires curled like veins. Dust and rust coated everything, but the shape of human presence remained everywhere. Boot marks on the floor, fingerprints stained into the steel, even a small cigarette tin resting near the commander's viewport. On the wall near the loader's position, someone had carved words with the tip of a knife. Heimat, 1945. Homeland. It was a farewell, scratched into iron. The historians said it was like stepping into a mausoleum. For decades, this tank had been sleeping under the ground, while the world above rebuilt itself, fell in love again, invented the internet, and forgot what real war smelled like. Yet here it was, unchanged, its silence heavier than any noise. Experts determined that the Panther had been disabled and buried deliberately. Parts of its engine had been removed, and the openings sealed with pitch and straw. It was an act, not of destruction, but of concealment. Perhaps the father had believed the tank might be useful again one day. Perhaps it was guilt that made him hide it, not wanting to destroy a symbol of the world he'd lost, but unable to face it anymore. Whatever the truth, his decision had sealed the machine like a time cap, and now, its awakening forced the village to remember what it had tried so hard to forget. By evening, as the last of the mud was cleared, the machine stood on the surface once more. Its armor was streaked with rainwater, its turret glistening darkly beneath the twilight. The reporters asked Dieter what it felt like to see it again. He said only, "It was never really gone." The words hung in the air, and no one dared to answer. Because in some way, everyone understood what he meant. The Panther was not just a relic, it was a mirror, reflecting the parts of the past that still lived quietly inside them. The sins of fathers, the silence of sons, and the ghosts that linger in every forgotten field of Europe. If you're watching this right now, tell us in the comments, from where in the world are you seeing this story unfold? They transported the Panther to a military museum near Hamburg under armed supervision, escorted by police and historians who followed its slow crawl through the narrow roads of Schleswig-Holstein. The truck carrying it moved like a funeral procession, its weight making the asphalt groan. Locals gathered along the route, phones raised, watching the steel beast return to the surface world. The sun reflected off its armor, dull and scarred, while the crane straps creaked under its mass. News channels filmed every moment. The headline that week called it the ghost tank of Wesslingen. But for the historians who had walked inside its rusted belly, the word ghost felt more literal than metaphorical. At the museum, the Panther was lowered onto wooden supports. Teams of conservators, archaeologists, and military experts surrounded it as if it were an unearthed temple. Every inch of the hull was documented, every bolt and joint photographed, every remaining inscription catalogued. Within the first few hours, they found a fragment of a uniform sleeve caught beneath the gunner's seat, its cloth brittle as paper, still bearing traces of grey wool and a single metal button embossed with an eagle. The human element changed everything. It was no longer just a vehicle, it was a grave, and that grave had a story. In the following weeks, research intensified. Files were pulled from the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. Military historians traced the serial number to Panzer Regiment 29 of the 12th Panzer Division. The last wartime report from that unit placed it near the outskirts of Kiel in April 1945, tasked with delaying the British advance while the remnants of the Wehrmacht tried to evacuate civilians through the Baltic ports. Among the archived documents was a list of tank crews. Entry number 17 caught their attention. Unteroffizier Ernst Kruse, commander of Panther 213045. The name was identical to the farmer's father. That discovery hit like a quiet explosion. Suddenly, the circle closed. The man who had hidden the tank had not been a bystander. He had commanded it. The machine had not been buried by an observer, but by its own master. The museum invited Dieter Kruse for questioning. He came reluctantly, walking with a cane, his face hard to read. When the historians presented the documents, he said nothing for a long while, then nodded slowly. "My father never spoke about the war," he said, his voice low. "Only once, when I was a boy, he told me he had driven a monster into the ground so it would never rise again. I thought it was a metaphor." They asked why his father would hide it, why he had risked his life to protect something that symbolized destruction. Dieter's answer was simple: because he was ashamed to destroy what he had once loved. That night, in the museum's storage hangar, a storm rolled in from the north. Rain battered the tin roof as wind howled through the corridors, rattling the glass of the display cases. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, the Panther sat in silence, glistening with condensation. A night guard swore later that he heard faint creaks, like footsteps inside the hull. Others laughed it off, but when he returned to his station, he found a small trickle of water running down the side of the turret, dark as oil, as if the machine itself were weeping. The following day, the conservation team began to open sealed compartments in the engine bay. Beneath one rusted panel, they found a leather pouch wrapped in cloth. Inside were documents, protected by grease and oil, field maps, identification cards, and a small diary written in tight, neat script. It was signed Ernst K. The diary spanned from February to April 1945. In its pages, the voice of the man who had once sat inside that tank came alive again. He wrote of long retreats, of frost, of fuel shortages, and of the strange guilt that settled in when he realized the war was lost, but he was still fighting. One entry read, "We were ordered to defend Kiel, but what are we defending? The bones of an idea. The sky burns at night, and the civilians look at us like ghosts. I keep hearing the engine even when it is silent. As the historians translated and analyzed each page, the image of Ernst Cruz shifted from faceless officer to tragic relic of a doomed generation. He was 27 when he commanded the Panther. The diary spoke not of ideology, but of exhaustion, a man trapped between obedience and conscience. The last entry, dated April 27, 1945, described the decision to bury the tank. "We cannot surrender it. They will destroy it, but I cannot destroy it myself. It has carried us through hell, and I will not kill it. I will let it sleep." After that, the pages ended. The historians stared at those words for a long time. It was as if the machine had been waiting all these decades for someone to read them aloud. When the story broke publicly, it divided opinion. Some called Ernst Cruz a coward for hiding the weapon of a murderous regime. Others saw in his act a strange form of repentance, an attempt to bury not only a tank but a fragment of guilt. Museums and TV stations fought for the rights to exhibit the Panther. The German government intervened, citing strict laws on the possession of war machinery. The tank was seized as state property, though it remained stored at the museum for restoration. For Dieter, the attention was unbearable. Reporters camped outside his home. People left notes on his gate, some calling him the keeper of history, others accusing his family of hiding war crime. He began to retreat into silence, just as his father had. One evening, he returned to the barn where the tank had slept for 70 years. The pit had been filled and leveled, but he stood over it, staring at the damp soil. The air smelled of earth and rain, and for the first time, he allowed himself to cry. He whispered something to the ground, as if speaking to his father or to the machine itself. Later, when asked what he had said, he only replied, "I told it that I forgave him." The Panther's discovery had begun as a curiosity, but it had become something deeper, a resurrection of memory, an excavation of shame, and a reminder that time does not bury everything completely. The past does not decay, it waits. If you felt that weight, that quiet, invisible pull of history in your own family's story, maybe this is the moment to stay with us. Subscribe, because the next part of this story goes even deeper into what they uncovered inside the tank and the truth they never expected to find. When they began the internal restoration of the Panther, the museum sealed the hangar to outsiders. Only a handful of authorized experts were allowed inside. The air smelled of rust, oil, and electricity. The tank stood under bright halogen lamps, its shadow thrown long across the concrete. Each creak of metal echoed through the space like a heartbeat. The team moved carefully, dressed in white suits and gloves, every movement deliberate. To them, the tank was both artifact and corpse. They opened it piece by piece, as if performing an autopsy on something that had once been alive. The first stage was mechanical. Engineers mapped the structure, dismantling portions of the turret, removing panels, cataloguing each object. They found ration tins, faded paper labels still legible, stamped with Wehrmachtverpflegung. A small aluminum cup lay beneath the commander's seat. Inside it, a folded scrap of paper, too deteriorated to read. The steel walls bore dozens of scratches, most accidental, some intentional. On one panel, near the loader's position, a series of small cuts formed a shape, a crude outline of a woman's face, a lover perhaps, carved in boredom or despair. Then they reached the engine compartment. The Maybach HL230 P30 engine was partially dismantled, its components removed before burial. That explained how the tank had been disabled. Yet within the engine bay, they found something else. Tucked behind the fuel tank was a small metal box, sealed with wax and wire. When opened, it revealed a bundle of photographs. They were curled and fragile, but under the restoration lights, the images emerged. Black and white portraits of young men in uniform, some smiling, some weary. One showed 5 soldiers posing beside the very Panther they were now standing in. On the back, written in faded pencil, was Kameradschaft, März 1945, Brotherhood. Beneath the photos lay a piece of cloth, a child's mitten, pink once, now the colour of old dust. No one spoke for several minutes. It was the anthropologist, Dr. Lenz, who noticed something behind the radio. There was a hollow space welded shut, almost invisible under layers of grime. They used a small torch to cut through it. The moment the panel fell away, a wave of stale air escaped, heavy, sour, lifeless. Inside, they found human bones, not many, fragments, a forearm, the remains of a skull. The historians froze. The silence in the room was absolute. They stopped filming, stopped taking notes. One of them whispered. He buried himself with it. The discovery forced a new theory. Perhaps Ernst Cruz had not buried the tank alone. Maybe one of his men had died inside, wounded or trapped, and Cruz couldn't bring himself to remove the body. Maybe the act of hiding the tank had also been an act of burial, not just for the machine, but for the man it had consumed. Forensic experts later confirmed the remains belonged to a male in his 20s. The bones bore evidence of shrapnel trauma. Time had erased his name, but not his story. Over the next days, they found more traces of human life: a tooth under the floor grating, a rusted harmonica near the ammunition rack, a wedding ring wedged between two steel plates. Each object deepened the atmosphere of the hangar until the team began to feel the weight of presence. As though the tank's silence had turned conscious, the restorers became restless. Some swore the air grew colder near the turret at night. One technician quit after hearing what he described as voices in the steel. Rational minds dismissed it, but still, they began working faster, eager to finish before the unease grew. The museum director, a pragmatic man, tried to reframe the narrative, to make the Panther a symbol of historical preservation, not a ghost story, but it refused to become that. The deeper they looked, the more human it felt. When the historians cleaned the periscope lens, they discovered one had a faint scratch etched into the glass from the inside. It was a single word, almost invisible: still. It could mean silent. It could mean alive. Nobody knew. The restoration log grew thicker. Every screw, every mark, every relic was photographed and entered into digital archive. Yet the question that haunted everyone was no longer what they had found, but why it had been hidden so carefully. Cruce's diary suggested he felt the tank was more than metal, that it carried something intangible, something that belonged to all who had fought within it. He wrote about hearing the sound of the engine even when it wasn't running, about dreaming of its hum. "It feels," one passage said, "as if the Panther remembers what we do not." During the following week, the bones were removed respectfully and sent for identification. They found no dog tags, no records to match the remains. The local church offered a small ceremony. Dieter Cruz attended in silence. He stood apart from the others, his coat soaked by drizzle. When the priest spoke the final blessing, Dieter turned his eyes to the horizon and muttered, "You're home now." It wasn't clear if he meant the man, his father, or the machine itself. That same night, one of the researchers stayed behind to photograph the interior under controlled light. His name was Lucas. He was young, idealistic, fascinated by machinery. Around midnight, alone in the hangar, he climbed into the tank through the driver's hatch. The flashlight beam swept over the controls, the empty seats, the narrow passage into the turret. He took dozens of photos, the clicks echoing sharply. Later, when the images were processed, something impossible appeared in two of them: a reflection on the steel, a faint human outline, seated at the commander's position, head bowed forward, hands resting on the handles. Not distinct enough to be proof, but clear enough to disturb everyone who saw it. The museum never released those images. They were archived under restricted access. Lucas left the project soon after, claiming he couldn't work near the Panther. "It's not just a tank," he said quietly to a colleague. "It's something waiting." The official restoration continued, but now with an undercurrent of fear. The tank had become an object of reverence, a mechanical tomb, a story too heavy to categorize. Historians debated whether to exhibit it at all. Some argued it should remain sealed, buried again. Others insisted that history must be faced, no matter how dark. Eventually, they reached the final compartment beneath the gunner's seat. Inside lay a folded cloth bundle wrapped in waxed paper. When they unwrapped it, they found letters. More than 20, written in neat German cursive, each addressed to the same name: Greta. The letters began in 1944 and ended abruptly in late April 1945. They told of cold nights, of hunger, of comrades lost, but also of love. Not romantic idealism, but desperate human attachment, the kind that survives even as the world collapses. One line, written 2 days before the last entry in the diary, read, "If they find us, they will erase us. But if I bury this with the Panther, maybe it will remember me longer than the world will." By the time the team finished cataloguing everything, it was clear that the discovery had transformed from archaeology into confession. The Panther had become a vessel of memory, a steel sarcophagus holding fragments of youth, loyalty, guilt, and longing. It was not a weapon anymore. It was testimony. And those who stood before it felt that strange, quiet pull that comes when you look directly into the eyes of the past and realize it is looking back. Now, the restoration was nearly complete, but what they were about to uncover next, hidden behind the control panel, deep inside the turret wall, would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the man who buried it and the war itself. The 4th month of restoration began in silence. The museum had grown used to the Panther's presence, but nobody spoke about it openly anymore. Visitors walked past the hangar without looking inside. Staff avoided being assigned to that section. It was as if the tank radiated a quiet gravity that pulled at the air. The team continued to document its components, but they no longer joked, no longer played music, no longer spoke unless necessary. The discovery of bones and letters had turned the project into something sacred. They handled each object as if it could still feel. One morning, while cleaning behind the driver's panel, a technician named Weber noticed a seam that didn't belong. It was almost invisible, a narrow line across the internal wall where the weld had been remelted decades earlier. At first, he assumed it was structural reinforcement, but when he tapped it with a rubber mallet, it sounded hollow. The engineers brought a scanning device. Behind the steel plate was a cavity, rectangular, sealed tight. It was large enough to hold a small crate. Orders came to proceed carefully. They cut a thin square along the seam, the sparks falling like orange rain. When the final piece of steel fell away, the room filled with a smell none of them could name: cold dust, oil, and something faintly organic, like parchment or bone. Inside the cavity was a wooden box, perfectly fitted to the space. The box was wrapped in oilcloth and secured with 2 brass clasps. The wood was black with age, but unbroken. Weber ran his gloved hand across it, and the surface left a grey smear on his palm. The lead conservator, Dr. Lenz, ordered silence. They lifted the box onto a table, surrounded by lights and cameras. No one spoke. The air seemed to vibrate. When they opened it, the hinges gave a dry sigh. Inside was a collection of documents, maps, notebooks, and one sealed envelope stamped with the symbol of the Wehrmacht High Command. Beneath them lay a smaller pack, wrapped in canvas and string. The first pages they examined were logistical records, dated March and April 1945, stamped Geheim, classified. The maps detailed defensive positions around Kiel and the Baltic evacuation routes, but among them was a hand-drawn chart, labelled simply Project Morgenstern. None of the historians had heard of it. The coordinates pointed to a coastal area near Flensburg. One page bore a strange symbol, not military, not official, a stylized sun with arrows pointing outward. The notes beside it were in Cruz's handwriting. They read, "We carry it north. It must not fall into Allied hands." The order came too late. No one knows what it truly is, only that it must remain unseen. The team exchanged uneasy looks. Could Cruz have been transporting something classified? Something never recorded in post-war archives? Lenz ordered the documents sent for analysis. They took photographs, transcriptions, and translations. A pattern emerged. Fragmented references to a late-war research initiative supposedly based near the Danish border, involving advanced communication technology and strategic material relocation. The kind of vague language that historians knew meant either myth or something erased deliberately. Beneath the papers lay the smaller canvas package. Inside it was a cylindrical metal canister, about 20 centimeters long, sealed at both ends. A label, faded but legible, read, Kiel 1504-45, confidential. They placed it under an X-ray scanner. Inside, the image revealed tightly rolled film reels, microfilm. They developed the film in a darkroom under supervision. The images that emerged were photographs, aerial reconnaissance shots, blueprints, and lists of names. Some of the photographs showed facilities that no longer existed, sites flattened or rebuilt after the war. One image, however, was unmistakable. A massive structure, partially buried in a cliffside near the coast, marked only as Installation 12. The caption beneath it read, Morgenstern Anlage. The revelation struck the historians with the cold force of something that should never have survived. Morgenstern, they realized, had been one of the countless late-war programs under the collapsing Reich. Desperate experiments, many abandoned or destroyed before the Allies arrived. But this one had no mention in any archive, no declassified file, no Allied intelligence. It was a hole in history, perfectly preserved within the steel ribs of the Panther. The tank had not merely been hidden to protect itself. It had been used as a vault, a courier for something meant to vanish forever. As the team pieced together the fragments, the picture darkened. Among the lists on the microfilm were not only names of officers, but also those of civilians, scientists, and even foreign prisoners of war, all labeled as technische Zeugen, technical witnesses. The term suggested they had been forced to work on the project, perhaps to witness or test something that could not be recorded in official channels. And besides several names, written in pencil, was a single note, eliminated. That night, Lenz couldn't sleep. She sat in her office surrounded by copies of the documents, reading and rereading Cruz's handwriting. His diary entries suddenly made new sense. His guilt, his refusal to destroy the tank, his insistence that it must sleep. It wasn't just about shame or nostalgia. He had been carrying something monstrous, and he'd known it. By burying the Panther, he hadn't just hidden a weapon, he had buried evidence, buried the proof of what his unit had been ordered to deliver, perhaps to prevent it from being used or discovered. The following morning, when they told Dieter about the find, he went silent. His eyes filled slowly with tears. He used to wake in the night, he said, calling for the engine to stop. He said it was still running somewhere, even underground. He paused, his voice trembling. Now I understand. It wasn't the machine he heard. It was the past refusing to die. The discovery of Project Morgenstern leaked almost immediately. The museum tried to contain the story, but journalists caught wind. Theories exploded online. Secret weapon, chemical research, occult experiment. Conspiracy sites feasted on. The truth was less sensational, but far more disturbing. The microfilm showed data on human testing, neurological mapping experiments using sensory deprivation and electromagnetic fields. Primitive, brutal, and useless. It was madness disguised as science, born from the final chaos of a dying regime. The documents mentioned only one surviving subject, evacuated north before capture. The name was redacted, but a fragment of address remained. Heikendorf, Barn 3. The connection was immediate. The Panther had been entombed under that very location. Cruz hadn't just hidden a tank. He'd entombed the last trace of a crime. Whether to protect others or himself, no one could tell. Perhaps both. That evening, the restoration team gathered one final time inside the hangar. The Panther stood silent, bathed in cold light. Its armor bore faint fingerprints from generations. Soldiers, farmers, historians, all drawn into its orbit. Lentz stood before it and whispered, "You've told us enough." The next day, she filed a motion to close the restoration and seal the machine permanently. The government approved it weeks later. The tank was cleaned, stabilized, and moved to a secure hall away from the public. Officially, it would remain a historical artifact under restricted study. Unofficially, those who had seen its contents agreed never to speak of them. The Panther had become what Cruz intended it to be, a tomb not for men, but for truth itself. Still, at night, when the hangar lights dimmed and the wind howled through the vents, the guards sometimes said they heard a low hum from the steel chamber, like an engine idling deep underground. Some dismissed it as imagination, others as settling metal. But one man swore that when he passed the viewing window, he saw a faint shimmer inside the turret, the reflection of a man sitting still, eyes forward, waiting for orders that would never come. If you've ever felt the pull of something buried, a secret your family, your town, or your history refuses to speak of, tell us in the comments. Write it simply. Some things should have stayed buried. When the Panther was finally sealed, the silence it left behind felt heavier than the roar of any engine. The hangar, where it had stood for months, became hollow, its emptiness filled only by the faint scent of oil that clung to the concrete. The project ended quietly, with no ceremony. The papers were filed, the reports archived under layers of classification. The government statement called it a historically significant restoration of a late-war armored vehicle. That was all. The official photographs showed the tank in neat museum lighting, its gun elevated slightly, its paint restored to dull green. But what the photographs did not show, what they could never show, were the faces of the people who had looked into its dark heart and found themselves reflected there. Dr. Lentz resigned a month later. She told her colleagues she needed distance, but the truth was that she couldn't escape the sound the metal made when it cooled at night, a low groan like a breath. She moved to a small town near Lübeck, rented a cottage by the sea, and spent her days walking along the shoreline, collecting fragments of driftwood and sea glass. Sometimes, in the whisper of the wind through the dunes, she thought she could hear the faint hum of that buried engine. She never spoke publicly about the project again. The rest of the team scattered. Weber took a job in Denmark. The technicians who had cut open the hidden compartment refused to work on military artifacts afterward. Some of them developed recurring dreams, always the same scene. A long, empty field, a tank rising slowly from the ground, its turret turning toward them, the air trembling with a deep metallic growl. They would wake drenched in sweat, unable to shake the sense that something in them had been uncovered too. In Fesslingen, the village where it had all begun, the story lingered like mist. Tourists came for a time, curious to see the place where the Panther had been found, snapping photos beside the rebuilt barn. But the locals avoided the subject. They said the land had been disturbed enough. Dieter Cruz lived out his final months quietly. Reporters tried to contact him, but he ignored them all. He spent his days tending the same apple trees that had watched the war pass twice, once in fire, once in memory. When he died, his will requested no marker on his grave. The only thing found among his belongings was a small black and white photo, faded to ghosts. 5 young men standing in front of the Panther, smiling at a world that no longer existed. After his funeral, his house was sold to a young couple from Hamburg. While renovating the attic, they found a sealed tin box under the floorboards. Inside were several items: a pocket watch, a lock of hair, and a letter addressed simply to "My son." The handwriting was unmistakably Ernst Kruz's. The paper was brittle, but the words were clear. "If you ever read this, it means the earth has given back what I tried to hide. I buried the Panther, not because I feared the Allies, but because I feared myself. What we carried was not a weapon, but our shame. I thought the ground might hold it longer than I could. Forgive me for giving you a silence instead of truth. Sometimes silence feels like mercy." The couple turned the letter over to the museum, but it was never made public. In academic circles, the Panther case became legend. Younger historians argued it represented the materialization of moral trauma, a physical embodiment of Germany's unfinished reckoning with its own past. Others dismissed it as an anomaly, a curiosity that told nothing new. Yet those who had stood near it, those who had heard the creak of its armor and smelled the damp iron of its belly, knew differently. They had looked into a wound that had never fully closed. The museum, now stripped of its haunted centerpiece, turned to safer exhibits: uniform, medals, rifles behind glass. But even there, something had changed. Visitors noticed a sense of restraint in the curator's descriptions, as if the words avoided touching the truth directly. Some evenings, after closing, a few of the staff swore they heard the faint thud of tracks in the distance, though no machinery moved nearby. It became a quiet superstition. If you stayed too long after dark, the past would start to move again. Years passed. Files were digitized, data indexed, and the Panther's story receded into the background noise of history. Yet the documents from Project Morgenstern remained sealed, their contents whispered about, but never officially acknowledged. Those who knew the full details agreed to let them fade. It wasn't censorship exactly, more a kind of collective exhaustion. There were truths that, once uncovered, left the world smaller, colder, and still. The story refused to vanish completely. Every few years, a journalist would track down one of the old researchers, or a photo of the tank would resurface online. Always, it carried the same aura, fascination mixed with unease. The image of that long barrel emerging from the soil, streaked with mud and time, became an icon of how the past insists on resurfacing, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. The last person to see the Panther up close was a night guard named Hannah. She was young, newly hired, not old enough to remember the Cold War, let alone the war before that. One winter night, she was making her rounds when she passed the sealed chamber where the tank was stored. The corridor was dark except for the pale emergency lights. She paused, feeling an inexplicable chill. Through the viewing glass, the shape of the Panther loomed, massive, silent, eternal. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing. For a moment, she thought she saw movement inside the turret, a faint shift of light, like someone turning their head. Then the reflection faded. She whispered to herself, "Rest," and walked away. Outside, snow was falling. The flakes landed softly on the museum roof, on the fields beyond, on the grave of the man who had hidden the machine. Each flake melted into the earth that had once swallowed a secret. And somewhere deep below, in the silence beneath layers of soil and memory, the hum of that buried engine finally faded, not into noise, but into peace. If you felt something during this story, that strange ache when the past feels too close, leave a sign in the comments. Just write, "I can feel the silence too." Time blurred the edges of the Panther story until it existed somewhere between history and legend. In the decades that followed, Germany rebuilt itself again, not from rubble, but from silence. Cities grew modern and clean. Children learned about the war in classrooms that smelled of chalk and rain. The past became something you visited, a museum, a documentary, a plaque beside an old field. Yet beneath that calm surface, the same current moved, unseen but unspent. The Panther remained locked away, sealed in the dim hall of the museum's restricted wing. Only a few curators still had clearance to enter. They called it the Sleeper, though never officially. It had become a symbol, not of power, not of defeat, but of endurance, a reminder that the earth keeps everything we give it. One of those curators was a man named Elias Braun. He was not a historian of war. He specialized in memory study, how objects hold emotional resonance beyond their function. When he first entered the hall to inspect humidity level, he expected to see a relic. What he found instead felt almost alive. The tank stood under dim security light, its steel dark and breathing with condensation. Dust hung in the air like mist. He approached slowly, listening to the faint creaks that came from the cooling metal, the sound of age settling into form. He placed his hand on the armor. It was cold, but not lifeless. "You've outlived everyone," he murmured, though he didn't know why. Elias began to study the Panther not as a machine, but as an artifact of silence. He read every document, every diary, every technical report the earlier team had compiled. The more he read, the more he felt the edges between the past and the present blur. He started to dream of it, not of war or battle, but of the tank sitting in an open field under moonlight, breathing, patient, waiting. In his dreams, it was never menacing. It was lonely, a monument abandoned by longing to be under. He wrote papers about mechanical ghosts, about how technology could absorb human memory like soil absorbs rain. His colleagues dismissed it as romanticism, but Elias didn't care. He believed that the Panther, sealed as it was, carried the emotional residue of its builders, its crew, its discoverers, all the hands that had touched it. Every machine, he argued, remembers. It doesn't think or feel, but it retains vibration, echo, trace. The Panther had been buried alive, and the weight of that burial had transformed it into something beyond a tank. Sometimes, when he stayed late in the museum, he would walk the empty corridor after closing. The building was quiet, except for the distant hum of ventilation. He would stop before the sealed glass of the restricted hall. Inside, under faint light, the Panther loomed in stillness. On some nights, he imagined he heard a faint rhythmic pulse, so low it was almost beneath hearing. He told himself it was the sound of the building's systems, or the shifting of air, but part of him knew it was something else, not a literal engine, but the echo of everything buried with it. Guilt, love, fear, youth, the emotional combustion of a vanished world. Outside the museum, the world moved fast. People argued over politics, over memory, over which histories deserved to be remembered. Statues were raised and torn down. Old symbols resurfaced in strange new forms. The war itself grew distant, then abstract, until it was little more than archive footage. And yet, every time someone dug into the earth, a new highway, a new foundation, something from that time surfaced again. A shell, a bone, a helmet. The war was gone, but it was everywhere. Elias came to believe the Panther had become its perfect metaphor, heavy, silent, indestructible, carrying inside it both pride and horror, beauty and damnation. He began recording audio near the tank, trying to capture the faint noises it made. When he played back the tapes, there was always a low hum. Some said it was interference, but when he increased the gain, he thought he heard something layered beneath. Not voices, not music, but rhythm, like breathing. Once he played the sound through a spectral analyzer. The pattern resembled a heartbeat. He saved the file under the name Panther, still alive, .wave, and never spoke of it again. Years later, he would write that the tank had taught him the truest lesson of history, that forgetting is impossible, that every act of burial is also an act of preservation. The ground does not consume, it conserves. Silence does not erase, it amplifies. What we call ghosts are merely the parts of us the world refuses to digest. By then, Elias had aged. His beard grayed, his eyes softened. He visited the Panther less often, but he still felt its presence when he passed the museum gates. One evening, near closing time, he returned one last time. The hall was quiet, the lights dimmed. He stood before the tank and spoke softly, as if addressing another man. "You did your duty," he said, "and so did he. Maybe that's enough." He stayed there for a long time, until the night guards found him sitting on the bench opposite the glass, eyes closed, breathing evenly, as if listening for an engine that was no longer there. They say he died that night, peacefully. The security footage showed nothing unusual, just Elias sitting in silence, while the lights dimmed automatically. But those who reviewed the final frames swore that, for one instant, the light from the emergency exit reflected off the Panther's turret, and inside the glass, you could see two figures sitting side by side. If you're still here, still feeling the weight of this story, stay with it a little longer. Leave a mark. Write "The silence remembers everything." The Panther rests now in a place the public cannot see. The hall that holds it is locked, its walls lined with quiet cameras that never blink, its air kept at perfect temperature and dryness. It stands alone, its green paint dulled to shadow, Its surface is coated in a thin layer of stillness. No voices reach it there, no footstep, only the slow hum of the ventilation and the occasional sigh of shifting steel. The plaque outside the door reads simply, Pez KPFW v AUSF, G, recovered near Wesslingen, 2015. Nothing more. To those who pass, it is just another relic, a line of text on a guided tour they will never take. But for those who have known its story, for those who have felt its weight, the Panther has become something beyond artifact. It is memory itself, solidified into form. Years have passed since anyone last opened its hatches. Dust has softened its edges. The lights that once bathed it in sterile brightness are now dim and tired, flickering in slow rhythm. Sometimes, during storms, the thunder rolls across the roof of the museum like distant artillery, and for a moment, the sound becomes indistinguishable from what the world once was. On those nights, the guards speak quietly, as if in a church. They say that the air in the restricted hall feels heavier, as though it's listening. No one knows what will happen to it in the future. There are proposals to dismantle the museum, to move the collection elsewhere, to reduce costs. Bureaucrats discuss it in offices far away, their voices detached, the war reduced to budget lines and storage code. They talk about melting down parts, recycling metal, or placing them in virtual archives, images instead of iron. But even they seem uneasy when the Panther's file comes up. Something in them resists the idea of erasing it completely. Perhaps they sense, in some deep, ancient way, that the machine still holds something alive, something that belongs not to war, but to human truth. For the few who still remember, the Panther has become an altar to everything left unsaid. It holds within its steel the contradictions of a century, invention and cruelty, courage and madness, duty and guilt. Every rivet, every plate, every scar carries a question no one has answered. What is history made of? Events, or the feelings we hide from them? What do we owe to the past? Remembrance or silence? The tank does not answer. It only endures, indifferent to the meanings humans project onto it. Yet in that indifference lies its strange grace. Outside, generations have come and gone. Children born decades after the war walk streets that were once rubble. They hold devices brighter than any flare, filled with more voices than any soldier could have imagined. They scroll through the past as though it were entertainment. Faces of generals, cities in flames, tanks like the Panther, rolling through black and white snow. They consume it in seconds and move on, unaware that one of those tanks still sits in the dark, real, heavy, and silent. It waits like an old god whose name has been forgotten, but whose presence cannot be erased. Sometimes, school groups tour the museum, though they never see the restricted wing. They pass the corridors of glass cases, uniforms, letters, medals, helmets. The guide speaks of strategy, casualty, surrender. The children nod politely, but their eyes wander. They do not understand yet that history breathes. One day they will. One day they will dig into the ground of their own time and find what their parents tried to bury. The Panther will still be there when that day comes. Its story will have changed again, as stories always do. Perhaps it will be a symbol of human folly, or a relic of courage, or merely a curiosity of engineering. But in truth it will always be what it has been since the day it was hidden, a confession. A machine built to destroy that became a vessel for remembrance, a silence heavy enough to outlast the men who made it. And maybe that is what history truly is. Not the noise of battle, not the flags or dates, but the silence that follows, the one that never leaves, the silence that hums beneath the ground, beneath museums, beneath our own lives, the silence that waits for someone to listen long enough to hear what it's saying. If this story found you, if it left that faint pressure behind your ribs, that quiet recognition of something old stirring with it, stay a moment longer, leave your sign before you go. Write it simply, I can still hear it.